also instrumental in bringing defense work to the Midwest. At his steelworks, he built locomotive boilers and 1,000 and 4,000-pound bomb casings. But the true heroes were at Caw Point, where the amphibious LCTs and LCMs were built. 2,000 of these landing craft were launched into the confluence of the Missouri and Kansas rivers, making the 1,000-mile journey to New Orleans and then to points beyond.
Well, the launching is like we see in the movies. The LST comes down the ramp and splash, and there's a big splash of water, and everybody shouts and yells, no, it didn't sink.
In late '43, Navy officials desperately needed 60 of the Darby LCTs, yet river levels were low. With no change after releasing water from a dam upriver, the government demanded that the huge vessels be transported by highway. Bridges were to be destroyed along the way.
We were very fortunate because the night before they were to destroy this bridge work, we had a heavenly rain, and they had enough water that they were able to launch them and get them down.
The following June, the reason for the frenzied orders became clear: D-Day. For fear of the mythical fifth column, no one at Darby could know the true reason for the haste. Security at every defense plant was a must.
When I applied for the job, I had my fingerprints taken and background searched by the FBI.
There was gates that you went through, right where the streetcars let you out, and you had to have a badge. If you didn't have that badge on, you couldn't get in.
And as you went out, you opened your lunch bucket up just to show them as you went out that you didn't have half the tools in your lunch bucket or something.
And you didn't talk to people about the job. They used to have all these stickers up all around the loose lips, big ships, one I remember so much. And there were arrests made. People who were suspected of sabotage in one way or another. Maybe because of what they said or how they said it, made people nervous about what their allegiance might be.
In contrast, the defense worker was also rewarded for her hard work with the prestigious Army-Navy E Award, given to companies for meeting production and safety goals. But the honor merely reflected the true goal behind the valiant work ethic.
Maybe that was your brother or your son or somebody you knew that was going to be flying that airplane, and you didn't want to do anything that would make it subject to failing or something.
Kansas City ultimately received 450 war contracts, achieving a major financial goal, with 1% of every American dollar going to firms in Jackson, Clay, and Wyandotte counties. American farmers could also be proud of their wartime effort, producing enough to feed not only our military and civilian populations, but millions of our allies overseas.
Actually, the farmers did very well during the war years. There was rain, the crops were good, the prices were high. Many, many farmers were able to pull themselves out of the depression because of the war. That was one good thing that came out of it. That was not the way we would have wanted to do it.
Crops were bountiful, but a labor drought arose as sons and fathers went to war. A great deal of farm work was done by the Women's Land Army, putting in as many man-hours as possible. But by 1944, the labor shortage had become severe. The solution was an unusual one. From 1942 through 1946, more than 400,000 German, Italian, and Japanese prisoners of war were interned in the United States. Scattered among 150 main camps and 500 branch camps, these men provided much-needed labor on farms and in non-war related factories. Several of these subcamps were located around Kansas City. In Liberty, the Miller family contracted their turkey farm to the government to house 600 of Rommel's elite 5th African Corps.
They looked like they were cloned, all blonde, blue-eyed, real physical specimens. I learned how my name should sound in German. Philipp Müller. Philipp Müller, how are you today, Philipp? And they'd throw me around like a sack of sugar.
The German POWs in Leavenworth were captured after D-Day and were amazed when they arrived in the U.S.
They didn't believe they were in New York Harbor when they got there because their propaganda had told them that New York had been absolutely bombed to the ground.
60 to 70 Italian POWs were stationed as close as the Riverside racetrack.
We would talk to the prisoners. A lot of them could speak pretty good English, and they liked it here because they knew that they weren't going to get shot at.
The Italian POWs even attended Mass at Holy Rosary Catholic Church.
And here were these fellas getting off the trucks in these old gray suits and talking to people in language and listening to a Mass, some of which was in Italian, for their sake. So that's about the closest war ever got to us.
However their time was spent, they were always grateful for a friendly face.
Please take this little handmade jewel case as a Christmas gift. Maybe it sounds like a kind of sentimentalism, but you cannot imagine how we are feeling while we are living behind that terrible barbed wire. Once you shook hands with me, I felt very happy in that moment. Maybe I can repay it after the war. Yours, Gunther Fisher.
Perhaps it was easy to befriend the German and Italian prisoners because we had neighbors of those nationalities. The same civility, however, was not extended to the American-born Japanese, or Nisei. Due to the fear of sabotage, entire populations of Nisei were forced into internment camps. Dr. William Lindsay Young, the president of Park University, then Park College, was concerned about the college students in these camps. Through a government agency, he was able to help some of them attend select Midwestern colleges. 15 Nisei came to Park. Well known for international outreach, the Park student body embraced the newcomers. The citizens of Parkville, however, did not.
As a matter of fact, the mayor was quoted in one of the New York newspapers as saying, if California doesn't want those Japs, we don't want them. So a number of the merchants downtown said, well, if they come down here and want to buy groceries at our grocery store or something at the drugstore down here, we're not going to serve them. So one of the things that the rest of we students were told on the campus was, don't ever let them go down there alone by themselves. Always make sure that one of you or more goes with them. That's the way we did it.
The Nisei graduates went on to great careers and look back on their time at Park fondly, illustrated by a donation letter to the college from Dr. William Yamamoto, a distinguished professor at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School.
And he went on to say that in a time when life was dreadful for me, Park College saved me. And so I make this contribution to Park College in memory of that. One of the most touching letters I've ever seen.
In September of 1940, 2 months after the fall of France, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, requiring adult males between the ages of 21 and 35 to register for the draft. National Guard and Reserve units were ordered to active duty for 1 year, preparing for the worst. But when it happened, we were still caught off guard.
I think it was a courteous thing on Japan's part, but I also think that some of our military should have known that such a fleet was moving across the Pacific.
And heard it on the radio, and immediately I thought, well, this little boy's going to go to the Army.
Overnight, recruiting offices were crammed with enraged citizens ready to defend their homeland. Kansas City quickly filled draft quotas, beginning with Noel Craven. Noel and his family were celebrating his 17th birthday when they heard the devastating news of Pearl Harbor. The next morning, Noel was the first recruit in line at the Navy enlistment office in Kansas City.
I woke up the next day and Noel was gone, and that was the last time I saw him was the day of his birthday.
Noel shipped out on a tanker as a gunner's mate, and during the Coral Sea Battle, became one of our first casualties.
And he was killed by a plane that they had shot down, and it crashed on the ship. Never seen my father cry until then.
Men like Noel were known as the Avengers of Pearl Harbor, volunteering for service. Yet men who were drafted did not begrudge their patriotic duty. Even those exempt from service, declared either 4F or as an essential worker, wished to do their part.
They didn't want a fella with one leg in anywhere, which I still think is a big mistake. They could have used me and let somebody release somebody else for active combat if that was their concern.
My dad tried to join I remember as a child him coming in one evening all distraught and actually almost in tears. He tried to join the Army and the Army refused to take him. They said, "You do more good staying on the farm right where you are." He felt like he wasn't doing his part.
The new recruits traveled to Fort Leavenworth for induction, where they took physicals and were assigned either Army or Navy. From there, they went to boot camp or other training sites throughout the states. The circumstances also called for accelerated officers training at various colleges and universities. Locally, these 90-day wonders could be found in a Naval V-12 unit at Park College, or on the campus of KU, training in the Merchant Marines, Coast Guard, and Naval Air Corps. In Kansas City, the Army Signal Corps set up schools specializing in radio and radar communications. And as a hotbed for aviation, it was not unusual to see glider pilots and paratroopers circling the skies around local airfields like Fairfax, Grandview, and Richards Field. Naval aviation cadets also received primary training at the Naval Air Station in Olathe, Kansas, 25 miles south of Kansas City, 1,000 miles from the nearest coast.
One of the reasons was that it was in the center part of the United States. Obviously, if the Japanese had wanted to come in to bomb, they could not have made it from the west coast to here. Who would believe the Navy be in the middle of the United States where there's no lakes or nothing here?
In the first 2 years, nearly 4,500 cadets were phased through NAS Olathe, including John Glenn and Bob Barker. The cadets trained in two-seater biplanes nicknamed Yellow Perils, which prepared them for their next assignment. In 1942, women were finally given the chance to join the military, if only to provide non-combat jobs in office and communications work.
We weren't trying to take the place of soldiers. We were just trying to do the jobs behind the lines where it was safe and where a able-bodied man could pick up the gun and go.
Just as their male counterparts, female recruits were sent to boot camp for training.
Our basic training was very similar to the same that the men got at that time. We did the same calisthenics, only not quite so many. We all saluted the officers and then stuck our tongues out at the sergeants when they were past us.
350,000 women served their country under the unusual acronyms of WACS, WAVES, WASPs, and SPARS. NAS Olathe was home to 40 WAVES, or Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service.
I was a flight orderly in Naval Air Transport Service, and we carried supplies, cargo, and if we had weight room, we would carry boys, Army, Navy, or Marines, that were trying to get across the United States.
Nor were the women Air Service pilots at Fairfax relegated to desk jobs. Instead of toting cargo, the WASPs actually piloted planes fresh from area factories to the war front. The women had to be skilled in flying every type of plane imaginable, including the huge B-29s and B-17s.
Women flew our B-25s out of Fairfax, out to the coast where they were loaded and shipped to the field, and some of them are still alive and still bragging about it.
Whether they were fresh recruits on their way to training or seasoned soldiers heading to the front, it was inevitable that most would pass through Union Station. And no matter how long their stay, the servicemen could always find a home away from home with the local USOs.
I believe the USO served one of the great purposes of morale. It was a place that an individual who was in a strange area and knew basically no one could go and relax.
There were about 10 or 12 schools. They were airline schools and radio schools, and there must have been 10,000 or more servicemen attending these schools in Kansas City. So we had a lot of local fellows who were here, and we were, of course, outnumbered.
Local women volunteered as senior and junior hostesses at the various clubs, lending a touch of home by sewing on patches or chevrons, or by simply talking to the lonely recruits. The USO was also a place to dance.
Oh, Well, I never learned to dance, so after I went to the canteen, but out of desperation, I guess they taught me how to dance. It was either that or not have anyone to dance with.
Although the USO provided relief from the war, it was while our boys were overseas that they most yearned for a sense of home.
I wrote to some that I never knew, never saw, just writing letters, because my brother had asked me to write to some of his friends.
I wrote to him every day. He wrote to me maybe once or twice a month, and that was understandable when they were in combat.
Miniaturized V-mail encouraged people to write and helped minimize postal bulk. Regardless, censorship proved an obstacle for most people.
Ever so often, apparently, they would write something that was censored, and it'd be blacked out, and you sometimes whole sentences, you know, and you, no matter how you held it up to the light, you couldn't read it.
That's why a lot of military guys never wrote home, because what could you say? You couldn't say what you're doing, you couldn't say where you were.
All too often, letters were returned to sender.
You know, a lot of them would write, and then pretty soon you didn't hear from him anymore, and you wondered, did they lose the address? Were they not living anymore, or what? Never knew. And one of the really sad and scary times was when the telegram came.
Receiving a telegram usually meant the worst for most families. So when the telegram came to the Wiseman home that Martin Wiseman had been taken prisoner by the Germans, the family sighed with relief.
Everybody was happy that he was safe, and thought they must have to treat them right because of the Geneva Convention. So life just kind of went on, and we just waited for news and did get a few letters from him. All he could say was, they are treating me well, and I'm looking forward to coming home, and I want a date with my wife. I'm very proud of her.
The date, however, never took place. Barbara's father died of pneumonia, still a prisoner of Germany. As a show of absolute commitment to the war, living room windows displayed banners with a silver star for each loved one in service. Families like the Wisemans changed their silver star to gold, indicating the ultimate sacrifice. Dedicating themselves to the ideology that we live by today, the men and women of our military actually fought the battles that we only know by name. Normandy, Anzio, Tripoli, Midway, Corregidor. So many battles, so much to gain, so much to lose.
You have no idea what fear the man has when he sees shells exploding all around and machine guns shattering. And
Well, I don't know how you describe when you're going down the road as a platoon and you start to get fired upon and you run for the ditch, if you can make the ditch.
there were times that we didn't even take our clothes off for 60 days. No new socks, no nothing, no underwear, no nothing for 60 days. K rations, fury. You were frightened the majority of the time, and then you got used to combat, and used to artillery rounds, mortar rounds, and machine gun firing. You figure today's your last day, so you live a full day.
Living the whole day was the only luxury for our American prisoners of war.
We had rifles and pistols, and they had tanks. Couldn't very well fight the tank with a pistol.
The fellas were pretty bad off from diarrhea, dysentery. They were taking them out 50 a day and burying them in one big hole.
We were very downhearted and didn't know what was going to happen to us, but I don't believe we ever lost our patriotism.
As our POWs hoped for rescue, the global war raged on. By early 1945, the tide was turning for the Allied forces, and it looked as if the war in Europe was coming to a close. But another era came to a close first, with the death on April 12th of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
He had been in office since the beginning of time, it seemed like.
So it was quite a shock because we knew no other president.
Poor Mr. Truman was kind of the hayseed from Missouri.
You know, a lot of people didn't like him, but I You won't find a serviceman in World War II that won't appreciate what he did for us.
A month later, Nazi Germany surrendered. Celebrations erupted throughout Europe. But for most Americans, it was bittersweet.
And of course, that first taste of victory was wonderful.
And I'll tell you, my knees shook. I had enough of that front line artillery stuff.
Some of my girlfriends and I went to church, and that was about the size of it. Battle in the Pacific was still going on, and we had paid a high price in the Pacific. Every island we took was a tough fight.
We were told that these people are not going to give up. We are going to have to invade Japan.
I know the Japanese were preparing themselves to fight to the last man.
Well, it looked like it was going to go on forever and ever and ever. Thank God for Harry Truman.
When they dropped the atomic bomb, we all cheered. There were jokes, I hope they have a dozen more. As far as we were concerned, we would have been happy to bomb the Japanese back to the Stone Age.
You hate to say it. You were glad it happened.
What happened in Nagasaki was terrible. What happened in the Battle of the Bulge was terrible. I don't know anything about war that's nice.
Right or wrong, the war was over. When the announcement came on August 15th of Japan's capitulation, a spontaneous spree erupted the world over.
There was this parade at 6 o'clock in the morning and church bells ringing in the background.
We went downtown, and it was like New Year's Eve. Everybody was in the street, and everybody was hugging everybody and kissing everybody, and if you didn't kiss somebody, they grabbed you, and somebody got up on the marquee at Jones' store down there with a trombone and was playing and singing. So it was kind of a wild night. I do think the most destruction anybody did was some of the hotels down there, slashing pillows and shaking the feathers out the windows down there.
Others observed the war's end in remembrance.
We had a very nice dinner, and we had a few drinks, and we had a short prayer for all the boys that we knew that were never going to be able to come back and party with us anymore.
Even with the war over, there was work to be done. Internationally, America assisted in the reconstruction of Europe and Japan. Nationally, we began the deconstruction of wartime industries. The War Assets Administration chose Kansas City as one of 3 sites to account for and process excess supplies coming in from all over the world. The government's contract with the manufacturers prevented any equipment gained or produced during the war from returning to the open market after the war, protecting their peacetime profits.
And then depending upon what the instructions were from the government, it seemed bad, but you would stand there while the guard would literally destroy a lot of new machinery. And the poor parts, they hit them with a sledgehammer and throw them in a boxcar, and away they went. We worked like the devil on them, and then they just throw them away in the boxcar. Hit them with a sledgehammer and let it go.
But more importantly, the end of the war brought our boys home.
That's really when we started flying the wounded boys back from the Pacific. So we had many hospital flights, and they were really the most rewarding work that we did in the service. They were very ill, they were in litters, many of them could not walk, and they never complained, no matter how hot it was or how cold it was. They were so happy to be coming home.
But what was fun was to see the women, the young girls and the women, when their husbands and friends would come home. You know, that was just a show all on its own.
The return of the GIs meant readjustments for many.
How do you assimilate 6 million people back into a society that has changed a great deal in the time they've been gone? How do you do that? Women got to get out in the workforce. Of course, they had to get back out of it when the war was over, because we had all these men coming home, lickety-split, with no jobs, you know. The war was over. You know, that's why we were there, was because of the war. And we expected not to have a job when the war was over.
But the war opened the door to new roles for women and minorities in society, setting the stage for the social reform in later decades. The end of the war brought about other changes as well.
We began to move away from a primarily rural society to an urban society. The housing developments that were built after the war became a pattern for the rest of this century.
We became a consumer society for sure.
50 years later, we look back on World War II with mixed emotions.
It was the only war in my lifetime, anyway, that everybody felt like we had to get into and win.
I heard less complaining then than any time since in my life.
If it wasn't for the war, I never would have been anything but a little old halfway mechanic down there. After that, I ended up as the superintendent of the department in Kansas City store.
When it was over, a little bit of color and interest went out, and there was a kind of a plateau of living.
I think the romance is in the history of it.
We fought the war so that all of us would have the right to be able to say and do the things that we do.
The cost was horrible. But at the time, there was no choice.
The men that were wounded and that were killed did more than I had ever done.
When I was out on my roller skates and enjoying my youth, they were out in savings.
I felt like maybe that I was doing something really right, not only for my country and for me, but for the world.
I think at the time it really brought out the best in everybody. I think it really did.
Funding for Over Here has been provided by gifts from Fred and Lou Hartwig of Roland Park and Mark and Nancy Gilman of Overland Park, Kansas.